The autumn mist clung to the towering pines like ghostly fingers as Sarah and her 3 friends made their way deeper into the Blackwood forest. What had started as an innocent weekend camping trip was about to become their worst nightmare. Sarah had found the location through an obscure hiking forum, a hidden gem deep in the forest. Looking back, she would realize how many warning signs they'd ignored. The gas station attendant who'd gone pale when she mentioned their destination. The lack of cell service that cut out miles before they reached the trailhead. "Are you sure this is the right trail?" Marcus asked, adjusting his heavy backpack. The sun was setting faster than expected, painting the forest in ominous shades of orange and crimson. "According to the map, we should reach the clearing in another mile," Sarah replied, though doubt crept into her voice. The trail markers had vanished, and every tree looked identical. The forest felt different, older, more menacing. Emma shivered beside Jake. "I don't like this place. It's too quiet. Where are all the birds?" She was right. The usual forest sounds had faded to an unsettling silence, broken only by the crunch of dead leaves beneath their boots. Even their voices seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. As darkness fell, they stumbled upon a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines that stretched impossibly high. The trees formed a perfect circle, their trunks scarred with deep gouges that looked like claw marks. "This will have to do," Sarah said, dropping her pack. They worked in tense silence, pitching tents and building a fire. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently. As they sat around the fire eating dinner, the forest began to whisper. At first barely audible, the whispers gradually became more distinct, more purposeful. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on unnaturally cold air. Marcus pulled out his radio, but heard only static punctuated by distant voices speaking in an unknown language. Emma's camera malfunctioned, showing pale figures in photos that hadn't been there when she pressed the shutter. "Did you guys hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The fire began to flicker strangely, flames bending in impossible directions. Then Marcus screamed. He was pointing at the clearing's edge, where a pale figure stood just beyond the firelight. It was impossibly thin, with limbs too long for its body. Its face was a blur of shadow and bone, but its eyes glowed with sickly yellow light. "What is that thing?" Sarah gasped. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched them with those horrible eyes. Then it began to glide, not walk, but glide, around the clearing's perimeter, always staying just outside the firelight. Jake grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the figure, but the beam seemed to bend around it, as if light itself was afraid to touch whatever that thing was. "We need to leave now," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. But when they turned to pack, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. The trail they'd used to enter was gone. Where it had been, there was now only an impenetrable wall of thorns and twisted branches. "That's impossible," Marcus stammered. The trail was right there. They searched the entire perimeter, but every exit was blocked by the same thorny barrier. The thorns weren't ordinary, they were massive, pulsing with their own life. When Marcus tried to cut through them, his blade snapped like glass. As they examined the barrier, they found remnants of other victims, a rusted camping cup, a child's sneaker, a backpack so deteriorated it crumbled at touch. Each item told a story of someone who had come here and never left. As the night wore on, more figures appeared. They emerged from between the trees like wraiths, each more disturbing than the last. Sarah realized with growing horror that these weren't just monsters, they were the remnants of other campers, twisted into spectral forms. The whispers grew to a chorus, and Sarah finally understood what they were saying. The forest was hungry, and this clearing was its feeding ground, a trap that had been operating for decades. Sarah tried her phone, but the screen showed impossible things, messages from dead relatives, photos of herself taken from angles that shouldn't exist. The images showed her sleeping, watched from above by something malevolent. The fire began to die despite their efforts to feed it. As the light faded, the figures pressed closer, their whispers becoming shrieks of hunger and rage. Jake had been growing increasingly agitated. "I can't take this anymore," he said suddenly. "I have to get out of here." Before anyone could stop him, he ran toward what seemed like a gap in the thorny barrier. The moment he stepped outside the clearing, the figures converged on him. His screams echoed through the forest as something unspeakable happened in the darkness. When the sound stopped, Jake was gone. Only his torn jacket remained, shredded from the inside out. The three survivors huddled together, feeding their belongings to the dying fire. But each item seemed to burn with memories, and they realized the fire was consuming pieces of their souls. As dawn should have broken, the forest remained dark. Time had stopped in this cursed place, trapping them in eternal night. The figures began speaking in familiar voices, Jake's voice, pleading for them to join him, followed by voices of dead relatives and lost friends. Marcus was next to break. "I hear her," he whispered. "My grandmother. She's calling me." The voice was perfect, exactly like his grandmother's, complete with her Polish accent. Before Sarah or Emma could stop him, he walked into the darkness. This time, there were no screams, only terrible silence. Then Marcus was back, standing among the pale figures, his form already shifting, his eyes taking on that sickly yellow glow. Emma was sobbing now, her sanity finally snapping. "I can't take it anymore," she whispered. "I want to go home." The figures began promising her everything she'd lost, speaking with her mother's voice, with voices of everyone she'd ever loved. Sarah watched in horror as Emma stood and walked toward the darkness, her movements puppet-like. Now Sarah was alone with the dying fire and circling figures. She could see them clearly, dozens of pale forms, including Jake, Marcus, and Emma, their eyes now glowing with that horrible light. But Sarah refused to surrender. Even as the voices called to her, even as promises of peace grew more seductive, she held on to her defiance. "I won't give up," she whispered. "I won't choose this." The figures grew agitated, their whispers becoming shrieks of frustration. They had never encountered such resistance. The fire guttered and died, plunging the clearing into absolute darkness. Sarah felt something cold touch her shoulder, but instead of surrendering, she did something unprecedented in this cursed place. She laughed. It was a sound of pure defiance, of absolute refusal to give in to despair. The pale figures recoiled as if burned, their forms flickering like candles in wind. "You can't have me," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "I choose to hope. I choose to fight." The forest began to shake, ancient trees swaying without wind. Cracks appeared in the thorny barrier, and through them, Sarah could see the faint light of dawn. But victory came at a cost. As the supernatural prison collapsed, Sarah felt something being torn from her soul. She would escape, but she would never be whole again. 3 days later, Sarah stumbled out of the forest, her hair white as snow, her eyes haunted by memories of things that should not exist. She spent months recovering from what doctors called severe psychological trauma. She never spoke about what happened in the clearing, but she did one thing that changed everything: she destroyed the forum post that had led them there and spent her life eliminating every reference to the hidden gem in Blackwood Forest. Sarah had become the guardian of the forest's secret, standing between the world and its ancient hunger. But she knew her victory was temporary. The forest was patient, and it would find other ways to lure the innocent. On certain nights, when mist rolls thick through the pines, hikers report hearing whispers in the wind, voices calling them deeper into the forest. The Blackwood Forest is always hungry, and it never stops calling. And in a clearing deep within those ancient woods, pale figures continue their eternal dance, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers. But now there are only 3 figures instead of 4, and sometimes they can be heard calling out to the one who escaped, calling for Sarah to come home, to complete the circle. For the forest remembers, and the forest is patient, and the forest is always, always hungry. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of Millbrook Forest as Alex and his girlfriend Riley set up their tent in what seemed like the perfect camping spot. They had hiked for hours to reach this secluded clearing, far from the crowded campgrounds and tourist trails. "This is exactly what we needed," Riley said, breathing in the crisp autumn air. "Just us, nature, and no cell service for miles." Alex nodded, though something about the silence bothered him. Forests were supposed to be full of life, birds chirping, insects buzzing, small animals rustling through the underbrush. But this place felt dead, as if the very trees were holding their breath. As they finished setting up camp, Alex noticed something odd. The trees surrounding their clearing were massive, ancient oaks that must have been hundreds of years old. But their bark was scarred with deep gouges, too regular to be natural damage. They looked almost like claw marks, but far too large to have been made by any animal he knew. "Look at this," Riley called out, crouching near the fire pit they'd built. She was holding up a small, white object. "Is this a tooth?" Alex took it from her, turning it over in his palm. It was definitely a tooth, but not from any animal he recognized. It was needle-sharp and slightly curved, about the size of his thumb. The root was stained dark with what looked like old blood. "Probably from a deer or something," he said, though he didn't believe it himself. He tossed the tooth into the fire, where it crackled and released a smell like burning hair. As darkness fell, they cooked their dinner over the open flame and tried to enjoy the peaceful evening. But the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crackling of their fire and the occasional groan of wind through the branches overhead. "Did you hear that?" Riley asked suddenly, gripping Alex's arm. He listened carefully. At first, he heard nothing but the usual forest sounds. Then he caught it, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the trees. It was so deep he felt it in his chest rather than heard it with his ears. "It's probably just the wind," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The thumping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from beneath the ground, as if something enormous was stirring in the earth below their feet. The fire began to flicker strangely, the flames dancing in patterns that defied the wind. Riley stood up abruptly, her face pale in the firelight. "Alex, I want to leave. Right now." But as she spoke, the thumping stopped. The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the sound had been. It was as if whatever had been making the noise was now listening, waiting. That's when they saw the eyes. Dozens of them, glowing a sickly yellow-green in the darkness beyond their fire. They were positioned at different heights, some near the ground, others high in the trees. But they all shared the same predatory intensity, the same alien intelligence. "Don't move," Alex whispered, though every instinct screamed at him to run. The eyes began to move, circling their campsite in a slow, deliberate pattern. As they shifted position, Alex caught glimpses of the creatures they belonged to. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen, part animal, part something else entirely. Their bodies seemed to shift and flow in the darkness, never quite settling into a fixed form. One of them stepped into the firelight, and Riley screamed. It stood about 7 feet tall, with unnaturally long limbs that ended in hands tipped with razor-sharp claws. Its skin was pale and translucent, revealing the dark network of veins beneath. Its face was the worst part, almost human, but stretched and distorted, with a mouth full of those needle-sharp teeth they'd found earlier. "What do you want?" Alex managed to choke out. The creature tilted its head, studying them with those horrible glowing eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like the whisper of wind through dry leaves. "Hungry," it said. "So very hungry." More creatures emerged from the darkness, surrounding their campsite. Some crawled on all fours like animals, while others stood upright like twisted parodies of humans. But they all shared that same translucent skin, those same glowing eyes, those same impossible teeth. Alex grabbed Riley's hand and pulled her toward their tent, but one of the creatures was already there, slashing through the nylon with its claws. Their sleeping bags and supplies spilled out onto the ground. "The fire," Riley gasped. "They're afraid of the fire." She was right. The creatures kept their distance from the flames, circling just outside the ring of light. But Alex could see that their woodpile was running low, and dawn was still hours away. "We need more wood," he said, eyeing the fallen branches scattered around the clearing. "I'll get it," Riley said, but Alex grabbed her arm. "No. We go together. We don't separate, no matter what." They moved as one, never straying far from the fire, gathering every piece of burnable material they could find. The creatures watched them with predatory patience, occasionally letting out low hisses or growls that made their skin crawl. As they worked, Alex noticed something that made his blood run cold. The ground around their campsite was littered with bones, human bones, picked clean and bleached white by time and weather. Some were small, like those of children. Others were clearly adult remains, but they were all arranged in strange patterns, as if they'd been placed there deliberately. "Oh God," Riley whispered, following his gaze. "How many people have they killed?" The largest creature, the one that had spoken to them, stepped closer to the fire. Its eyes reflected the flames like mirrors. "Many," it said, its voice carrying an obscene satisfaction. "Many, many, many. This is our feeding ground. Our sacred place. You trespass." "We didn't know," Alex said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll leave. Right now." The creature's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile, revealing row upon row of those terrible teeth. "Leave," it hissed. "But you are the main course. We have been waiting. Watching. Preparing." As if on cue, the other creatures began to move closer, their forms shifting and changing in the firelight. Some grew larger, more monstrous. Others seemed to melt into the shadows, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. Alex fed more wood to the fire, but he could see they were fighting a losing battle. The flames were their only protection, but their fuel was finite. And the creatures had all the time in the world. "There has to be a way out," Riley said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Alex looked around desperately. The trees were too close together to squeeze between, and the creatures had surrounded them completely. But then he noticed something, a gap in the circle of bones, a small space where the ground looked different. "There," he said, pointing. "That might be a path." The creatures followed his gaze and let out a collective hiss of displeasure. The largest one stepped directly into their path, its claws extending to their full length. "No escape," it said. "This is the feeding ground. You feed us, or you become us." "Become you?" Riley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature's smile widened. "The choice is yours. Quick death, or slow transformation. Either way, you will serve our hunger." That's when Alex noticed something else. Some of the creatures looked almost human, their transformations incomplete. They moved with the shambling gait of the recently changed, their eyes still holding traces of human intelligence alongside the alien hunger. They were people, he realized with horror. All of them were people once. The creature nodded approvingly. "Clever. Yes, they were like you. Campers, hikers, hunters. All so eager to commune with nature. And now they are nature, part of our eternal feast." Riley grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it like a weapon. "Stay back." The creatures recoiled from the flames, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they began to move in a coordinated pattern, trying to separate the two humans, to force them away from the fire. "We need to run," Alex said. "On 3. 1, 2. But before he could say 3, one of the creatures launched itself at Riley from the side. She screamed and swung the burning branch, catching the thing across the face. It shrieked and fell back, its translucent skin smoking where the fire had touched it. "The fire hurts them," she shouted. "Really hurts them." Alex grabbed another burning branch and together they began to fight their way toward the gap in the bone circle. The creatures pressed in from all sides, their claws and teeth flashing in the firelight, but the flames kept them at bay. They reached the gap and plunged through, running blindly into the darkness beyond. Behind them, the creatures let out a collective howl of rage and frustration. But their victory was short-lived. As they stumbled through the dark forest, Alex realized they were hopelessly lost. The trees all looked the same, and without the fire, they could barely see their hands in front of their faces. "Which way?" Riley panted, her burning branch beginning to gutter out. Alex looked around desperately. That's when he saw it, a faint light glowing in the distance. It looked like another campfire, which meant other people, safety, help. "There," he said, pointing toward the light. They ran toward it, crashing through the underbrush, their makeshift torches barely lighting the way. The light grew brighter as they approached, and Alex's heart leaped with hope. But as they burst into the clearing, his hope turned to horror. It was their campsite. Somehow, impossibly, they had run in a circle and ended up exactly where they started. The fire was still burning, their scattered supplies still lay on the ground, and the creatures were waiting for them. "Welcome back," the largest creature said, its voice filled with dark amusement. "Did you enjoy your run?" Alex felt Riley's hand slip from his as she collapsed to her knees, sobbing. The hope drained out of him like water from a broken cup. They were trapped, caught in some kind of supernatural maze that led nowhere but back to their doom. "How?" he whispered. "This is our place," the creature replied. "Our territory. Here, we make the rules. The forest bends to our will, and all paths lead to the feeding ground." The creatures began to close in again, their eyes glowing with anticipation. Alex grabbed Riley and pulled her to her feet, but he could see the defeat in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, holding her close. "I'm so sorry I brought you here." The largest creature was almost upon them now, its claws extended, its mouth open to reveal those terrible teeth. Alex closed his eyes and waited for the end. But it never came. Instead, he heard a sound like thunder, and the creature let out a shriek of pain. Alex opened his eyes to see the thing writhing on the ground, its translucent skin smoking and bubbling. Standing at the edge of the clearing was an old man with a shotgun, flanked by two other figures. They were all dressed in hunting gear, and their faces were grim with determination. "Salt rounds," the old man said, ejecting a spent shell from his weapon. "Burns them like acid." The other creatures scattered at the sight of the newcomers, melting back into the shadows with hisses of rage. "Come on," the old man said, gesturing for Alex and Riley to follow. "We need to get you out of here before they regroup." As they hurried away from the clearing, Alex found his voice. "Who are you? How did you find us?" "Name's Henderson," the old man replied. "Been hunting these things for 20 years, ever since they took my son. We heard the screaming and came running." "What are they?" Riley asked, still shaking with terror. "Wendigos," Henderson said grimly. "Or something like them. They've been feeding in these woods for generations, growing stronger with each kill. The forest itself is infected now, twisted by their presence." They reached a dirt road where a truck was waiting. Henderson helped them into the back while his companions kept watch. "You're lucky," he said as they drove away. "Most people who encounter them don't live to tell about it." Alex looked back at the dark forest receding behind them. "Will they follow us?" Henderson shook his head. "They're bound to their feeding ground. But they'll find others. They always do." As they reached civilization, Alex realized they would never be the same. The memory of those glowing eyes, those terrible teeth, would haunt them forever. And somewhere in the depths of Millbrook Forest, the creatures were waiting for their next meal, patient as death itself. The feeding ground was always hungry, and it would never stop calling to the unwary. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The screaming started at 3:17 a.m. Emma jerked awake in her tent, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sound echoed through the Crimson Ridge forest. It wasn't quite human, too high-pitched, too desperate, like someone being torn apart from the inside. The sound lasted for nearly 30 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Did you hear that?" whispered Alex from the tent beside hers, his voice barely audible through the thin nylon walls. Everyone heard it, came David's shaky reply from across their small campsite. "What the hell was that?" Emma unzipped her tent flap and peered out into the darkness. Their campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting weak, dancing shadows across the ring of 4 tents they'd set up in the clearing. Beyond the faint circle of light, the towering Douglas firs loomed like silent sentinels, their branches creating an impenetrable wall of darkness. "Maybe it was just an animal," suggested Lisa, though her voice carried no conviction. "A cougar or something." "Cougars don't scream like that," David said, emerging from his tent with a flashlight. The beam wavered as his hands shook. "That sounded like someone was being murdered." Emma crawled out of her tent, grateful for the warmth of the dying fire. The 4 college friends had been planning this camping trip for months, a celebration of their graduation, a final adventure before they all went their separate ways. They'd chosen Crimson Ridge specifically because it was remote, untouched by civilization. Now that remoteness felt like a death sentence. "We should call for help," Emma said, fumbling for her phone. The screen showed no signal, just as it had for the past 2 days. "Shit. Still nothing." "The nearest ranger station is 20 miles away," Alex said, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "Even if we started hiking now, it would take us all day to get there." Another sound drifted through the forest, not a scream this time, but something worse. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. It was coming from the direction of the old logging trail they'd used to reach the campsite. "Everyone stay calm," David said, though his own voice was rising with panic. Let's build up the fire and wait for daylight. Whatever's out there, it probably won't come near the light." They worked in tense silence, feeding logs to the fire until the flames roared back to life. The light pushed back the darkness by a few precious feet, but it also made Emma realize how truly isolated they were. The forest pressed in on all sides, a wall of black trees that seemed to lean inward, as if the very woods were trying to swallow them whole. "Look at this," Lisa said, kneeling beside the fire. She was holding something small and white, a piece of fabric. "I found it stuck on my tent zipper. It wasn't there when we set up camp." Emma took the fabric and held it up to the light. It was cotton, old and yellowed, with what looked like dark stains along one edge. The material felt wrong somehow, too cold, too rough, as if it had been buried in damp earth for years. "That's not ours," Alex said, backing away from the fire. "None of us brought anything like that." The dragging sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a new noise, a low, rhythmic moaning that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. The fire flickered, and for a moment, Emma could swear she saw shapes moving between the trees. Tall, impossibly thin figures that swayed back and forth like kelp in an ocean current. "We need to leave," she said, her voice cracking. "Right now. Pack everything up and get out of here." "In the dark. We'll get lost," David protested, but his eyes were fixed on the treeline, where the shadows seemed to be growing deeper despite the fire's light. "We'll get killed if we stay here," Emma shot back. "That thing out there, whatever it is, it's not going away. And it's getting closer." As if in response to her words, the moaning grew louder, more insistent. The sound seemed to burrow into their minds, making their teeth ache and their vision blur. Lisa suddenly doubled over, retching violently, while Alex stumbled backward, his hands clutched to his head. "Something's wrong with the air," he gasped. It's like poison." Emma felt it too, a thick, choking sensation that made every breath a struggle. The very atmosphere around them seemed to be changing, becoming heavier, more oppressive. The fire began to sputter and dim, no matter how much wood they threw on it. "The tents," David said, his voice distant and strange. "Something's in the tents." Emma spun around and saw what he meant. Their carefully arranged campsite was no longer empty. Dark shapes moved within each tent, bulging against the fabric walls like trapped animals. But the shapes were too large, too wrong to be anything natural. "Run," she whispered, then louder, "Run." They fled into the forest, abandoning their gear and their plans, crashing through the underbrush like panicked deer. Behind them, the sound of ripping fabric filled the air as whatever had been in their tents broke free. The moaning grew to a crescendo, joined by new sounds, clicking, chittering noises that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Emma's flashlight beam jerked wildly as she ran, illuminating brief glimpses of the nightmare around them. The trees were moving, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The ground beneath their feet felt soft and spongy, as if they were running across a carpet of decay. "The trail!" David shouted from somewhere behind her. "Find the trail!" But there was no trail anymore. The forest had changed, become a labyrinth of twisted trunks and hanging moss. Every direction looked the same, every path led deeper into the darkness. Emma's lungs burned as she ran, her legs shaking with exhaustion and terror. A scream echoed through the trees, Lisa's voice, cut short with horrible abruptness. Emma stopped, listening, but heard only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant moaning that seemed to follow them wherever they went. "Lisa!" Alex's voice cracked as he called out. "Lisa!" There was no answer. They huddled together in a small clearing, their flashlights creating a pitiful circle of light in the overwhelming darkness. 3 of them now, Emma, David, and Alex. Lisa was gone, swallowed by the hungry forest. "We have to keep moving," Emma said, though her voice was barely a whisper. "If we stay in one place, it'll find us." "What is it?" David asked, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell is hunting us?" Emma looked up at the canopy above them, where the branches formed twisted patterns against the starless sky. She thought she could see faces in the bark of the trees, twisted expressions of pain and terror. The forest itself seemed alive, malevolent, feeding on their fear. "I don't know," she said. "But it's not going to let us leave." The moaning started again, closer than ever, and with it came the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, circling their position. In the dancing light of their flashlights, Emma caught glimpses of pale figures moving between the trees, their movements jerky and unnatural. "They're everywhere," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. The figures began to close in, their moaning growing louder, more insistent. Emma realized with growing horror that the sounds weren't coming from the creatures themselves, they were coming from the victims they'd claimed. Lisa's voice was there, twisted and wrong, calling out in anguish. And there were others too, voices from years past, decades past, all the souls the forest had claimed. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered to her friends, knowing these would likely be her last words. "I'm so sorry I brought us here." The creatures stepped into the light, and Emma saw their faces, or what remained of them. They had once been human, she realized, but the forest had changed them, twisted them into something else. Their skin was bark rough and pale as moonlight, their eyes hollow voids that seemed to drink in the light. As the creatures reached for them with fingers like gnarled branches, Emma's last thought was that they would become part of the forest now, part of the moaning chorus that lured other victims into the darkness. The cycle would continue, as it had for generations, feeding the hungry woods with fresh terror and despair. The flashlights flickered and died, and the forest reclaimed its silence, waiting patiently for the next group of campers to stumble into its embrace.